everyone, I'm Stan Mallow. Welcome to Paranormal Yacker. My guest on today's show is Nigel Watson. I'll be yakking with him about his book, UFOs of the First World War, Phantom Airships, Balloons, Aircraft, and Other Mysterious Aerial Phenomena. Nigel Watson, welcome to Paranormal Yacker.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Nigel, you have written for numerous publications, including All About History, Beyond, Fortean Times, Paranormal Magazine, UFO Matrix, and Weird.com. You have also authored several books about UFOs. What was there about the UFO phenomena that originally sparked your interest in wanting to write about it?
It started a long time ago. It was the Apollo moon missions that really got my interest in the subject. I just got fascinated by, the rockets and the technology, and that we were sort of at the fringes of science and technology. We were going to go to the moon, somewhere people had dreamt about going for so long. With every mission, it would be on TV or in the newspapers. In particular, the Apollo 8 mission fascinated me because that was the first one where we saw the Earth from the moon, and we got a bit of a concept of the planet Earth being just a small speck in a vast universe. I collected newspaper clippings and everything. I even cut out pieces from a newspaper in the school library. I'd often see a teacher picking up a newspaper with a big hole in it. I think, no, we're going to rumble me this time. I think that's what led me to collecting news clippings. I collected everything I could about the Apollo missions and anything to do with space. And of course, that kind of slowly vectored into UFO sightings. Books like Chariots of the Gods came out and were serialized in the British newspapers. I cut out the serializations, and obviously when I got a bit older, I could afford to buy the paperback or any books coming out. But there's a lot of interest in space exploration. Obviously, with the newspapers and everything, I started getting UFO books from the local library. I kind of vectored away from sort of spaceships, real spaceships, into, the possibility that aliens were visiting us. It seemed logical. If we could, in just a few years, build a spaceship, inventing the ability to fly, it seemed like aliens on another planet would, in a few hundred years, easily, conquer the vastness of space. My thinking at the time, and I think a lot of books at that time, Donald Keyhoe and people like that were saying, there were government secrets, that there were spacecraft coming. A lot of the sensible books looked at the fact that UFOs might be remote controlled craft just visiting and surveying our planet. With stranger and stranger UFO cases, people have said, aliens are actually visiting us, and then it's kind of carried on into abductions, really. Another thing with my interest is I was able to contact some other people through the local newspapers. I lived in Scunthorpe, a small steel town in the northeast of England. With a bit of a newspaper publicity, we were able to set up a UFO group in the sort of early 1970s. There was about 30, 40 members, and we'd have weekly meetings. And so I suppose that kept my interest alive, and people brought in new ideas and everything. And we also started interviewing UFO witnesses. We got quite a few reports locally. A lot of them were just like lights in the sky or could be explained. But it was quite an interesting case where several people saw sort of a large orange globe fly over Scunthorpe. Even my own grandmother saw that as well. I don't know exactly what that was, but it's a bit frustrating though, because a lot of cases are of lights in the sky. It doesn't matter how much research you might do, it still remains a kind of light in the sky. It's really hard to pin down, even if you check every local airport or look up star charts.
You point out in your book that strange objects in the sky have baffled humanity since the dawn of time. Today, we call them flying saucers, UFOs in the past, they've been called everything from chariots of fire to phantom airships. Also, where they come from, what they are, and their purpose has been widely discussed and disputed. Do you think the names these unexplained objects appearing in the sky were given and their perceived purpose were influenced by the circumstances, the history, the happenings of what was going on in the lives of the people who saw them, as well as the times they were living in?
This is a good area to look at. About UFOs seem to, or things seen in the sky seem to change according to people's expectations. When we were inventing airships, phantom airships were seen. When in the Second World War, pilots often saw jet aircraft or rockets just when the Germans were about to bring jet aircraft and rockets into the theatre of war. And it's almost like some people have argued that aliens are kind of shaping what we see, they're manipulating humanity. I think it's called the control hypothesis. People like Jacques Vallée proposed that throughout time. The UFO phenomenon has been shaped, showing itself to us in the way we expect. But you can also look at it from the other angle, that human psychology and sociology is at play, and that when people are expecting to see things in the sky, they do see what they expect to see. Like the pilots in the Second World War, they saw jet aircraft. In fact, there's a few accounts of them saying they actually shot down jet aircraft when none were operating in that area, because they could track down records after the war and find out no such jet activity occurred. There's a fantastic book by Graham Randall about Foo Fighters that has just come out. It's called UFOs Before Roswell, and that catalogues most of the major Foo Fighters seen in that period. It's a good sequel to my own book about UFOs of the First World War. In particular, before the First World War, in Britain, in 1909 and 1913, people kept seeing phantom airships. And this was just at a time when Britain was very scared of Count Zeppelin and his Zeppelin craft. These were massive craft, and it could be a massive game changer in terms of warfare, because Britain was basically protected by a Royal Navy. So if Zeppelins could fly over the English Channel, but people speculated about what havoc they could inflict on the nation. They said London could be reduced to rubble by Zeppelins. Obviously, there's a lot of interest in anything unusual in the skies. I think in particular in 1909, several newspapers were eager to report these stories to get more interest in the subject, because they wanted people to get behind projects to build anti-aircraft guns and to build our own airship fleet. So there was a lot of worry about warfare with Germany. That encouraged people seeing things really and interpreting them as a German airship. It's interesting though, if you go out and look at the night sky, it's not a blank canvas. It is full of things like, meteors, stars moving behind clouds. Even the moon's been mistaken for a landed flying saucer on some occasions. And I don't know if you've ever driven at night. If you look at the moon, you feel like you're driving on a straight road. Obviously it isn't straight, so the moon seems to be moving about in the sky. There's so many things going on in the sky, and perhaps like with the Second World War pilots, we tried explaining several of them as being down to wartime stress. It's a bit difficult to take on board because obviously all their senses were tuned to looking out for things. Obviously what decisions were made could be, life and death decisions. We were on a sort of psychological edge. Some of the things they saw do seem very hard to pin down as German technology. So it does make you wonder what was going on in the skies over Europe. And it's the same in the First World War. The British often had sightings of airships, particularly at the outbreak of a war. An area called the Lake District the chief constable of that police force was constantly reporting sightings to the Ministry of War, and they got kind of fed up with him reporting so many sightings. In 1916, the British War Office actually issued a document about how to explain and investigate unusual sightings. I think this was the first ever report of how to investigate UFOs, really, because they were worried that every time somebody reported a strange light in the sky as an aircraft or airship, factories had to close down and people went into air raid shelters. All these rumours of German aircraft, or there's also rumours of cars driving down country lanes and signalling at German aircraft at night to target the bombing. You know, people were obviously listening to these sort of rumours, even if it weren't very well based. People were suspicious of houses in the countryside that had lights on, thinking these were German bases. You know, people got a bit strung up about these things, which is understandable, you know, when, you know, a huge world war is occurring on your doorstep. I think the so thing, though, is it's fascinating to look at how, even in our modern era, we've gone from flying saucers to unidentified flying objects to UAPs of today. The names change along with people's perceptions. And also there's this thing about the tic-tac UFOs being seen. So anything people see now is going to be like a tic-tac rather than a domed flying saucer. I think UFOs change, and the names of UFOs change like fashions, really.
Many UFO sighting reports during World War I came from UK pilots who claimed to see objects of unknown origin flying close to their planes. How did they describe what they saw? And was there any interaction between the UK pilots and the unknown objects they claimed to encounter?
I think one night over London, 2 or 3 pilots on the same night said they saw German aircraft. And one described it as being like a train with carriages, carriage windows in it. It gives the impression of something large and lit up inside. One pilot actually closed in on what he thought was a German aircraft or something unusual, and even shot at it with his pistol, because obviously during the First World War, a lot of aircraft weren't equipped with, adequate guns or armament. So he actually could be regarded as the first person to actually have a sort of dogfight with a flying saucer or whatever it was. We never did pin down what the pilots had seen. It was possible some of the sightings were of a Zeppelin, but in this particular encounter, it doesn't seem like that was the case. So we don't really know what he was shooting at. He was obviously ahead of a curve in terms of a pilot encounter with a UFO of some sort. There's quite a tragic case, actually, of a report over London of an aircraft, German aircraft or something coming. A man was sent up in a tethered balloon to look out for this light, but he actually fell out of a basket. There were sort of tragic consequences sometimes to looking out for anything strange in the sky. He obviously is probably not the first person who's chased a UFO and paid for it with his life.
One of the most bizarre reports of UFO encounters has to be about Manfred van Richthofen, known by most people today as the Red Baron, who, while flying over Belgium, encountered a saucer-shaped craft. Supposedly, he shot the craft down and 2 people escaped from it. What's your take on that story?
It's a brilliant story, but it was told in the Weekly World News, which isn't the best source of information, unfortunately, unless you watch the Men in Black films, and then they use the tabloids for the latest news on alien activity. But with further research, the person who reported this story was, I think he was about 94, and said he'd flown with the Red Baron, but none of the facts of the story really match with what reality is, really. It was just a made-up story. I think it's a great one because, we used it on the cover of a book. I think it's just a good combination of a most famous sort of fighter pilot encountering a saucer. Another thing with that is, like people have pointed out, how would such an aircraft, even with a talented pilot, get to shoot down an advanced flying saucer craft? It would be a quite remarkable feat. And also that they saw some sort of alien creatures get out of a crash flying saucer and go into the woods. That would be a brilliant story if any of the facts stacked up. But I think that's the case so often. It's same with the Second World War. Some of the best stories are told a few years afterwards, like people claimed had worked on secret projects to create Nazi saucers. No facts are really pinned down to the actual World War II documentation and hardware, but people have cashed in on, the fantasy of the Nazis having flying saucers, really. And some people say Hitler flew away to Antarctica to escape, and stories like that. So I think if a story is told a few years after the period when it was meant to occur, often that's when red flags really fly, and you've got to be kind of a bit more aware of why the story is being told, really.
In Turkey in 1915, it was reported that several hundred British troops went to the top of a hill. A large cloud came over the hill, and when the cloud went away, all the soldiers had disappeared. How did such an incredible incident gain the traction it did?
That's another story that was told at a reunion in 1965. That's the first the story was really told by Anzac troops who were getting together and reminiscing about the Gallipoli campaign, which was a terrible campaign that didn't really work out for the British forces and their allies. There is an actual report that does mention clouds, and it's on the opposite page is something about missing soldiers. We've kind of collapsed the two stories of a cloud going over a hill with missing troops. I think they kind of made it up into a kind of UFO context by 1965. Whereas I think at the time, a cloud might have been seen, but it had nothing to do with the disappearance of the troops. And in fact, it was a few years after the First World War that a mass grave was found of most of the so-called missing troops. Some of them had come from the Sandringham estate, which is a royal estate. They didn't like to tell the king that a lot of the people from his estate had got killed and put into a mass grave. In a way, the authorities didn't really want to, they preferred having it as a mystery of just sort of disappeared in the fog of battle, sweep it under the carpet, really. So there's that way of keeping the mystery alive, really, and then people bringing in the UFO context, many decades later. That is a story that is often repeated in books and magazines and on websites. But there's probably one or two books. There's even a film about it. They kind of go into it in more detail. But I think my book was really trying to chronicle the main sightings that were reported at the time in government records or newspapers. So I've kind of tacked on the Red Baron and Gallipoli stories at the end for kind of completeness, really.
Since the Paranormal Yakka Show emanates from Canada, I would be amiss, Nigel, if I did not ask you about the Scaroplanes of Canada. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, they're brilliant because when Canada joined the war, they had sightings virtually straight away in September 1914. There again, the very name Scaroplanes, indicates an aircraft of some sort rather than an airship or anything. They were often put in the context of spies and saboteurs. I think there's a few stories of them, seeing spies in conjunction with these aircraft. Over Ottawa, they were seen, and I think on at least one occasion, all the government lights were put out. They felt they were going to be attacked. I think it's interesting, that it was a worldwide phenomenon and not just, stuck in Britain, really. And the Canadian ones also match up a little. There's a bit of overlap between the Canadians and the United States, where again, sightings were at over DuPont sites. There were stories of saboteurs and attacks there. But what seems to happen, and it's the same with UFO waves, is you get one really good case or a few really good cases, then you get some really rubbish ones where people start finding deflated balloons or flying kites, or somebody comes out and said, yeah, it was me, I caused it, or that I made up that story. You start off with a lot of excitement and then it dribbles off, really. Either newspapers obviously move on to other subjects, things, whatever wanted to be achieved by publicising this has been achieved. Politicians have used it to make people aware of, the potential of German air raids and things. Being in Canada, I think you're virtually pretty safe from that. One bloke did tell a tall story of saying he was ferrying aircraft, I think from the USA to Canada. And he said he was involved in a dogfight with a German aircraft over the Canadian border. But I think there again, it's one of these stories that was made up to impress the locals, really. And there again, there wasn't that much substance to it, really. I think that's a frustrating thing, really, that, you have to sort of read between the lines of a lot of these reports, or why certain newspapers are critical of the stories and why the newspapers are promoting them. And there's that issue, particularly before the war, because, in Britain, we were obviously gearing up for a war with Germany, but there were also sightings in New Zealand and Australia. That was probably because they were getting reports from Britain, through newspaper stories, and their slant on it was they felt that German warships were launching airships. But a lot of the Australian and New Zealand sightings are more like boat-shaped craft rather than an airship-shaped thing. There again was some quite interesting sightings, and it's speculated there were a few local inventors might have caused them, but I don't think any of the local inventors had created anything as impressive as what some people reported. And there was a case of school children seeing one of these sort of boat-like airships, and the teacher ran screaming, thinking the world was going to end. So I don't think she was a very good role model for the kids, really. It does show there's fear of something in the sky. I'm not sure. I think later some of the children said it was a made-up story or something, but that doesn't, really explain about the teacher unless, that was part of a made-up story. But they didn't really confess to that till about a few decades after the First World War. But it's interesting how it did spread to other countries, as fear of war. But in the United States, we had a character called Tillinghast. At the end of 1909, he said he'd created an airship that had caused loads of sightings in the area of Boston, Massachusetts. There again, that caused a lot of interest because, if he'd invented a craft that was capable of flying to sort of New York, and he virtually flew as far as the Statue of Liberty, and then he turned back and he said he stopped the aircraft in midair to do repairs and then carried on, which would be virtually impossible, really. He tried to get money to build an aircraft engine plant in the United States, but in the end, I don't think the scheme really took off. But because of all these sightings and people expect, we had reporters chasing Tillinghast and everything. But I think he just cashed in on the fervour about seeing weird things in the sky. And some of them, like a lot of the British ones, when you've got lots of people viewing an airship at night in a city, it's usually due to something like Venus or people sending up like Chinese balloons or something. And some of them you can actually pin down to being Venus or some star. But if people start pointing at a star and then some people say it's moving and things like that, we do have a kind of a herd mentality, really. And there is this psychological thing of the autokinetic effect. If you stare at a bright light in a dark room, it'll start moving about. And obviously, if you're looking into the sky, there are no reference points, really. So a bright light could be really close to you, or it could be miles away. a faint light could be really close to you, even though it's far away. So, there's this thing about our own perception of lights in the sky. And we've even done autokinetic experiments where if you show a stationary light to a group of people, and then there's one person saying it's moving, everyone else will then start seeing it moving as well. So there is that thing about if you've got big groups of people seeing something, it's more than likely, it is something explainable. I think that's the key of Foo Fighters in the Second World War and other things seen in the First World War. It's hard to actually pin down. There isn't one answer to them. There might be some were caused by, celestial phenomenon and misperception and meteors, and even people sending up flares, and searchlights are another one, searchlights bouncing off clouds. So I think like the Ministry of War issued this document about how to look at all the different factors that might cause a kind of sighting of an airship or an aircraft, and to be critical of it, because there again, at the beginning of a war, people didn't know what to expect. They were more likely to report the slightest thing, and obviously people who were coming to research it or look into it equally fearful of German airships as the witnesses, so perhaps piling fuel onto misperception. So we had to kind of put a lid on it, really, to try and sort out fact from fiction. And I think that's what happened during the Cold War, really. The United States Air Force felt they couldn't keep a lid on UFO sightings and felt they had to do something about it. It was sort of upsetting. What if missiles were really being sent by the Russians? We wouldn't be able to tell, one story from another. So we wanted to try and pin down the facts of what was true and what wasn't. Where again, that was a period of near warfare, much like the pre-First World War period, where flying saucers, particularly in the cinema as well, were portrayed as sort of foreign and invaders. A lot of them were lightly concealed as communists, basically.
Could you tell me, Nigel, of all the UFO sightings you've investigated that occurred during World War I, which ones did you find to be the most credible?
I think the Lethbridge one, although it's got lots of photos in it, it was actually investigated by journalists and people looked at it. And also it had the corroborating story of the dockers seeing it on the same night. He did see something, he said he actually saw two men as well, and that he regarded them as German. But with modern day close encounters of a third kind, often the aliens speak in a sort of guttural tongue or seem to act in a strange manner. Like some people have pointed out, that with the two Germans jumping into the basket and flying away, it doesn't seem credible that they would be able to fly away so quickly in a hot air balloon. And also, would the Germans risk flying something like that at night? Even in the Second World War, it was very perilous to fly at night. If they were flying at night, they'd have had to have something like a warship or base near the Bristol Channel. This is something that also came up with the sightings in the Lake District. Because there were so many sightings being reported, they speculated that there was a German aircraft base somewhere in the Lake District, and we even sent out an aircraft painted white to search the area. But obviously sending an aircraft into the area didn't really help, so it could easily be mistaken for a German aircraft. So it was a bit dangerous mission, really. You could be shot down by your own people. But we did send troops and Boy Scouts out onto the hills to look out for any airship bases. And I think in Scotland, they even issued a reward for the discovery of any aircraft base. We're looking out for any isolated spots where Germans might be operating and where they might be buying fuel and supplies and things. But obviously no base was found. I think the Lethbridge case, for all its faults, and I think you could dismiss it as perhaps a story, it did seem very convincing to the journalists. It's just a bit flaky about of his newspaper clippings and the furrow in the ground. So you don't really, I think that's a problem. It's hard to really pin down what happened, in terms of even modern day cases. But I think that's quite a good one. And also there was sightings in Sheerness at the end of 1912, reported by people from the sort of, there's a naval base, and we had a little air base as well. And some of the pilots there said they saw an aircraft of some sort with lights and making a sound over Sheerness. That got kind of reported to the Winston Churchill. Questions were asked about it in the House of Commons, and there again, behind the scenes, the government wasn't sure what had been seen. Germans had an experimental flight of a Zeppelin in that time frame, but we felt that it couldn't possibly have travelled so far on that night because it landed at an earlier time. But the worst stories that some other German airship had flown over just to prove it could do it, sort of thing. But there's kind of there again, it seems unlikely that any German craft had done it, even though there was speculation about it. And some newspapers, said, oh yeah, it was definitely a German one, but the facts don't really stack up to that. So, that's an interesting case because it was made by pilots and it was reported to higher people in authority, and then it got in the House of Commons where questions were asked about it. And that kind of triggered the 1913 airship scare, where literally hundreds of people in different towns in Britain saw airships. But like I say, there were probably Venus or some other planetary reason for them to see it. But because of the questions being asked in the House of Commons, there were a lot more sightings. But the sightings weren't as good or in detail as in the Lethbridge case.
Should viewers of Paranormal Yacker want to buy UFOs of the First World War or Captured by Aliens, another book you've written, one that I look forward to interviewing you about at a later date, how do they do that?
You can just go on Amazon. Both books are on Amazon, and that's probably the best place to go to. I think they both have their own. UFOs of the First World War is produced by the History Press in Britain, so it's on the History Press website. But probably Amazon's best because the UFOs of the First World War is also there's a Kindle version of it as well, which is quite handy to have. So if you don't want to be bothered with a paperback, it's quite handy to get the Kindle version. I also do, there's a Facebook page. I've got one for my UFO investigations manual, and then I've got one for the UFOs of the First World War, sort of Facebook page as well. I think you'd have to kind of search for them really, but it shouldn't be too difficult.
Nigel Watson, I thank you for being my guest on Paranormal Yacker. I very much enjoyed yakking with you.
Thank you very much.
Hi everyone, I'm Stan Mallow, the Paranormal Yacker. I hope you enjoyed the interview you just watched. To be sure you don't miss any interviews on my free YouTube channel, all you have to do is press the subscribe button on your screen.